In this video, I'm going to give you 5 tips for getting your shit together in After Effects. Hi, I'm Adam Bennett, this is the Video Shop. Before we start, a disclaimer. I made this video with students in mind, as I was sick of hearing myself wang on about folder structure relentlessly, and I'm damn sure that they were sick of hearing about it. Having your shit together is a good habit to get into from day one. I talked briefly about it in my 10 tips for freelancing video. Have your shit together. So this video is very much aimed at future students, or anyone out there not familiar with file management. Yeah. You're going to be hearing a lot of sexy phrases like file management or intuitive workflow in this video. I'll try and jazz it up with film clips, but there's only so much I can do to make it interesting. Disclaimer ends. In my previous video, 10 tips for beginners, I talked about general workflow related subjects, such as frame rates and export settings. Things to be aware of when you're just starting out. In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into this, work tidy, because it's such an important area. A boring area, admittedly, but an important one. I always tell students to organise their projects in such a way that if they suddenly drop dead, someone else could effortlessly take over. The way to do that is by having an intuitive workflow. We'll come back to this very shortly, but first, why does having your shit together matter? Some of you might be totally new to After Effects, and you just want to create cool motion graphics. Who cares if the project files are a mess? If you don't know the answer to that question, just ask any experienced motion designer. I promise every one of them will have a story of a project they took over, which was a complete car crash, where they opened the project files and they either wasted precious time trying to unravel a Gordian knot of confusing files and assets, or wasted client money by having to redo things. You don't want to be that person. Incredibly, there are a lot in the industry. I've worked with some. Experienced designers who should know better. It marks you out as being sloppy, thoughtless and careless. Don't you even care? Your work might be amazing, but no one works in a bubble.
I work alone.
But even if you do,
you know that.
You might be asked to hand over project files to a client. At some point, your working methods will be exposed. What's more, working tidily will save you time. You'll be able to find things quicker in your project, and there's far less chance of losing files or assets. If you're just starting out, your early projects might be small, but before long you'll graduate to bigger projects which will require good project management. So if you develop good habits early, you'll find that part easier. Okay, let's get started. Tip 1. Use a folder structure. Every project of mine, whether it's client work or personal, has a folder structure. And it's pretty much the same for every project. The idea is that everything has its place, such as the graphics here. It should be easy to navigate around and find things. In the past, when I've asked to see a student's project folder, they've shown me something like this. All their working files were in the downloads folder, mixed in with shortcuts and exe files. It's a recipe for losing your work, or your mind. For the benefit of any complete beginners out there, let's start with the basics. Let's say you're starting a new project, so we'll create a new folder. Let's call it Kick-Ass Motion Graphics. Yeah, why not? I've got a shortcut here for the template folder structure that I always use. So I can just copy and paste these folders. So now we've got the folder structure here. You want to name your files properly, so I'll copy the folder name and paste it here onto the AE file. This After Effects file is a template as well, so when we open it, we've got the same folder structure within it. So you've got a folder structure for your projects on your hard drive and also one within After Effects, and they pretty much mirror each other. So we've got folders here for graphics and footage, etc. There are some differences. Here I've got folders in the project structure such as fonts and supplied, which I don't need in After Effects. If a client supplies a script or storyboard, I'll put them there. Then the final folder here is where I'll render the final file or files. For client is for whips to send to the client, or if it's personal projects, I'll put render tests there. Then in After Effects, if I need to pre-render any elements to save time, I'll put them here, and the pre-commas folder is pretty self-explanatory. There's no right or wrong for folder structures such as these. It will depend on what you're doing. If you're doing a lot of editing or 3D work, you might have different folders, but this is what I give it to students. You could create a script within After Effects that you can run from here that will create your folder structure. That will be an alternative to having a template After Effects file. Or if you've got a Wacom tablet like I do, you can record keystrokes and assign a button on your tablet that will do the same thing. But that's for a future video. Tip 2. Don't rename comps on export. The reason I've got AA, AB, AC, etc. in these folder names is so the final folder is at the top. It makes the final composition easy to find, the same way that it's good to keep cameras and other important layers at the top of your timeline window, but we'll come back to that. Let's take this animation that I did for a client last year. I've tweaked it enough so I can give away the project file and use it here without breaching an NDA. Well, I think so. I guess I'll find out. I've removed the logo and changed all the names they gave me to the cast of Beverly Hills Cop instead. Anyway, the comp name is Rubik's Cube. If you've done different versions and received amends, you might be tempted to rename it when you export. Don't do it this way. Rename the comp itself, and then either duplicate that composition in After Effects so you've got different versions within the same file, or if there's lots of pre-comps like I've got here and that becomes too tricky, you can increment save your file. I'm anal, so I prefer having just one After Effects file in the main folder, and then any other older versions I can hide away in a backup folder.
I hope the hell you're making a point.
The point of all this is to keep the file names the same as comp names. And this is the case not just with final exports, but anything you render out of After Effects, such as pre-comps. It goes back to intuitive workflow. If I jumped on someone else's project and needed to find things, I should be able to take the file name, minus the extension, paste it into this search file here, and then find the comp.
What is this? This is your life?
Tip 3. Be organised. Look out for a separate video on this, but briefly, name your assets and pre-comps. Shy layers to keep your timeline clean. In this comp I've left keyframe nulls and cameras unshied, so it's easy to tweak the animation. Leave notes if you need to. These can be helpful if you're handing a project over to someone else, or if you're like me and you're clinically forgetful and you need to remind yourself of something when you next open the project. You can also leave notes on layers. Tip 4. Keep a live render queue. Back when I was head of motion design at my old company, by the way, head of motion design, this wasn't at Buck or Imaginary Forces, it was a small company and I only became head of motion design because my boss left.
What's your name? You! That's my name!
Anyway, back when I was head of motion design, I tried and failed to get my staff to go along with this, but I would absolutely die on this hill. Once you're ready to render, add your comp to the render queue, and then save your project before you render. You may send your render to Media Encoder or render out of After Effects, but either way, when you reopen your project, it has your animation live in your render queue, ready to render, and you don't have to set it up again. This is especially helpful when you have multiple assets that you need to render out, such as the graphics for this video. After Effects doesn't remember relative file paths when you add to the render queue, meaning if you jump from one project to another, it will want to send your file to the last place you directed it to. Also, you won't have to set up the render settings every time. Tip 5. Have a cloud backup. You definitely want to have autosave enabled, and it can be a lifesaver, but I'd recommend also having some kind of cloud backup. I use Dropbox, but use whatever suits you. I haven't really researched this. I use local sync, so the files on my hard drive are constantly being backed up to the cloud. And I've recovered projects in the past using this method, where autosave has let me down. Don't ask me why, but sometimes it can be a bit unreliable. You check the autosave folder and the last saved version is 2 or 3 hours ago, something like that. Using cloud backup can also be handy for sharing files and working collaboratively, but I'll save that for another video. And that's it. 5 tips for getting your shit together in After Effects. Thanks for watching, see you again soon.